if your life isn't working the way you want it to be working and you're not thriving and happy and, full octane doing your thing, you probably have some trauma. And it doesn't have to be a forever life sentence. It's not a mental illness. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but trauma is an injury. I tell people it's like your brain gets sucker punched by life and it heals.
This is your Kick-Ass Life podcast, episode number 358 with guest Britt Frank.
This is the Your Kick-Ass Life podcast with Andrea Owen, a no BS guide to self-help and badassery. Because ladies, let's face it, life's too short for it to not kick ass. And here's your host, the girl who serves it up straight with a side of crazy, Andrea Owen.
Hey there, ass kickers. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I am so glad that you are here. I have been head down finishing up this book, which I know it feels like I've been talking about it forever and ever, amen. I don't know if it feels that way for all of you, but I am contracted to turn in my manuscript on November 1st. So as I'm recording this, that's just a couple of weeks away, and I'm putting the finishing touches on it. And one of my favorite parts of writing both this book and my last book is writing the introduction. I don't know, partly because I feel like it is more personal. I am writing you kind of a love letter. I mean, it's literally, dear reader, like I'm writing it to you. And in this particular book, I'm talking about what brought me to write this book. And to be perfectly honest with you, and I write about this in the introduction, it came from a place of anger. And there is just such, I've told all of you that I am familiar with anger. It feels very familiar. And I'm also not afraid of my anger, which I know many, many women are, not all, but many. And so for me, it is part of my passion. It's part of my drive. It's what pushes me forward to not only be the best version of myself, but to be the best leader for all of you, to talk about what has been bestowed on me to talk about. I truly believe that the messages that I put out on the show and in my books are sort of downloaded to me from something bigger than me, from the universe, from the common thread that we all have that is love, whatever you want to call it. And I channel that into these books, and more specifically, I channel that into the introduction, where I'm sort of kicking it off and writing you this love letter. So that's what I was working on this morning and just felt compelled to tell you about it. I also wrote a little poem that's going to go in the beginning of the book. It's pretty short, but it came to me one day and I hand wrote it out, and I happened upon it in my notes. I wrote it a few months ago. I wrote it during COVID, and I was like, this has to go in the book. This has to go in the very beginning of the book. So I'm excited for you to read that. It comes out August 2021. I know it seems like a lifetime away, but alas, that is how the publishing industry works. It goes into a bunch of edits and all of that. So thank you for staying with me, and thank you for sharing the excitement in this book. In the next few episodes, I will share with you the title, and I, just going to drip out a little bit of information a little bit at a time. I am also very excited to bring you today's guest. Britt Frank is someone who was recommended to me by a colleague, and a couple of colleagues, actually. I specifically put the word out that I needed somebody to come on to talk about healing from really difficult or abusive relationships, traumatic relationships, maybe even relationships with narcissists. And Britt's name came up. I learned so much in this episode. You will hear me having head explosions, aha moments, having to pause as I am thinking about my own life and my own past. And I'm really excited to have you listen and learn from her as well. So for those of you that don't know her, let me tell you a little bit about Britt. Britt Frank is a trauma therapist, teacher, and speaker who specializes in the science of stuck. Britt's work empowers people to understand the inner mechanisms of their brains and bodies. When we know how things work, the capacity for choice is restored and life can and does change. She received her undergraduate from Duke University and her master's from the University of Kansas, where she is now an award-winning adjunct professor. Britt is also a somatic experiencing practitioner and level 1 trained in internal family systems. So without further ado, here is Britt. Britt, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Andrea. I'm so happy to be here.
I am excited because my friend, our mutual friend, Nicole Whiting, I was asking around for, I don't think I told you this. So I specifically asked, I said, who do you know out there? Who are the experts who help women heal from narcissists?
Hi, I'm Britt.
She texted me back. She's like, Britt Frank, you need to have her on. So it's one of those things that I haven't had anybody on specifically to talk about this, but I have personal experience in this, and it's just something that's been on my radar. I think more and more people are talking about it. Mm-hmm. And I want to kind of let's start with the term narcissist, because I think it gets thrown around so much. It even has become like a name calling type of thing. Like, people are no longer assholes, they're narcissists. So can you tell us what exactly that is, maybe even from a clinical standpoint, and maybe how does someone know that they might be in a relationship with someone or from their past?
I am so glad that you're talking about this. And really, the clinical world has not caught up. I didn't learn about this in grad school or in post-grad training or even in trauma training. I learned this because I lived it, and then I had to learn it. And then there are very few people in the clinical world actually doing this work. So I'm so glad it's getting picked up in mainstream. That said, like you said, the word gets totally tossed around. So what is a narcissist? First, let's talk about narcissism is a quality that we all have. Everyone has shades of narcissism. You do, I do. And it's just a self-protection mechanism where we focus on our image at, the expense of what's real. And I think we all do that too. A degree. Now, a spectrum of narcissism has super low ends, people who just don't give a shit and they're like, this is me, take it, whatever. The high end is really what we're talking about when we're talking about narcissists. The malignant, I will say, it's just kind of dark. It feels really evil when you're in it. People who are so high up the spectrum that they are choosing really to not be human anymore. It's an addiction. High-level narcissism is an addiction to self-protection by any means necessary.
Interesting. Okay. It's fascinating because when I talk about it, and mostly if I'm talking about I have an ex-husband and an ex-boyfriend that I had back to back, and they had very similar qualities. And it was, if you look at where I was in my life, it was all a perfect storm. But when I talk about those relationships, I'm careful and I say, I don't know if they were like clinical narcissists, but they definitely had narcissistic tendencies.
So clinical narcissists, I got into it on Instagram this last week about that. Narcissists have to be diagnosed by a licensed clinician. Well, I am a licensed clinician, and I can tell you narcissists don't seek treatment.
I was just going to say, I don't think they go to therapy.
They don't go to therapy. Occasionally, but really, narcissism is the only issue where the symptoms show up in the friends and family, not the person who has the thing. There's no other thing. If I'm depressed, you're not going to all of a sudden be laying on your couch. But narcissism is the only clinical issue where symptoms are presented in the sufferers of, friends and family. Narcissists can't be clinically diagnosed, and it's super rare. So I will stand toe to toe with anyone who says they have to be diagnosed by a clinician. If you think you were involved with a narcissist, we don't have to split hairs over the words. If it was bad and you were in chaos and crazy making and so confused about what was real and who you are and where you are, we'll just call that, yes, you were in a relationship with a narcissist.
Mm-hmm. I think why one of the reasons that I'm a little bit hesitant to label, let's just talk about my ex-husband for a second, is because it was sort of in and out. He wasn't always acting like that. Like there were periods of time where we were normal and he was pretty much normal. But when it was bad, it was bad. Like so much gaslighting. I didn't know which way was up. I was beginning to think that I was going crazy because he was telling me that I am crazy. And then he would push me to the brink of mental breakdowns and then would use that as proof that I was crazy. And it got really bad towards the end. He was living a double life and was having an affair and also lying to his girlfriend about still being married to me. And then she got pregnant and it fell apart. And then it got even worse from that, believe it or not. So, but again, like we had periods of time where it was normal and we had like what I would consider a normal and even healthy relationship.
So, and I'm welcome to the club, Andrea. We have jackets.
Okay.
I hate that you had to go through that. You know, I lived this too, and it's some next level fuckery. So this is why I think of narcissism as an addiction and not as a personality disorder. Now, the clinical world, which is always 10 to 20 years behind anyway, the clinical world will classify it as a personality disorder. I do not. Narcissism actually functions like an addiction, which is why with you actually did experience periods of relative peace, relative calm, like any addiction. When the use, quote unquote, amplifies, the insanity amplifies. But people don't, drug user, and I'm a recovering drug addict too. People don't use drugs at the same level, at the same severity, constantly. It ebbs and flows. So what I'm hearing you say is that there were periods of high use and periods of lower use. So I will classify narcissism as an addiction 100%.
That is fascinating. And I've never heard of it being talked about that way, but it makes so much sense. And some of the puzzle pieces are falling together. And it's interesting. So I just hired a new therapist a few months ago, and part of the reason is to heal from the trauma from that relationship, which I feel like I didn't totally. I did some EMDR before and that was really helpful, but I came to realize when COVID hit, I think a lot of people's shit came to the surface.
I've been very busy. Yes.
I'm sure. I was going to ask about that towards the end here, but I hired her, and one of the things that I noticed is that, and that I admitted to her, and I had a lot of shame around admitting it, is that I was gaslighting him as well. And I learned how to do it from him. And I felt like, I remember at the time thinking that was my only measure of power and control, was to do it back. And now that you say that it's an addiction, I'm like, I can totally see that, where it felt like the only shred of power to quote unquote kind of get on top of the relationship was to do it back to him. Which I felt terrible about. It feels shitty, because that's not who I am. And especially even in retrospect, I'm like, I look back and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I behaved like that.
I did some
but it was
crazy.
A mess.
It is a mess. And we also want to differentiate between kind of reacting to abuse in crazy ways and perpetrating it. So when in my relationships with high-level narcissists, and I had multiple, I did some really fucked up stuff, really bad that I've worked through, no shame, whatever. But a lot of that was in response to the abuse, the covert, the overt, the gaslighting. So there's a degree to which reactive abuse is not quite the same, but again, it's an addiction. Addiction as to define it, so we're all talking about the same thing, is anything that a person uses. It could be a substance, it could be a behavior, it could be anything, to avoid their reality. They need increasing amounts of the thing. They continue to do the thing despite negative consequences. That's the definition of an addiction. That's narcissism.
Reactive abuse. That's a term I've never heard before either. And that's interesting. And also makes a lot of sense. Okay. We're only 5 minutes in and I've already learned so much. Next question. Okay. Well, you say, because I either pulled this from your website or from another interview that you did that I heard, where you say that your goal is dismantling the health system myths that keep us feeling stuck and sick. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of the mental health system isn't perfect. It's what we have. So my disclaimer is we need it for people who don't have access to resources. We need the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual, whatever. But by and large, the mental health system does not recognize trauma, and it absolutely does not recognize the devastation that happens with narcissistic abuse. It's not talked about. You won't hear it in classrooms. You won't hear it in continuing ed. It's a very, very new subspecial. I mean, narcissism isn't new, but being able to, see it and work with it in the field is incredibly new. And so, one of the myths is for partners is that you're crazy, or that, I thought I had a personality disorder because I went so, off, my rocker when I was in these relationships. But, like we were saying, a trauma response, or which is the same as a reacting to abuse, is not a mental illness. And currently the mental health world will look at your symptoms, throw a diagnosis on you, medicate you, and then boom. And there's nothing wrong with medication. But if we don't take trauma into account, we're going to all, as partners, self-diagnose. And that's not right. That is inaccurate.
There's a lot to unpack in that. Yes. So what is do you have a sort of dream of how you would like the mental health system to be, or do we not have enough hours?
My mental health system dream is that every practitioner would understand trauma, would understand the impact of trauma, would know how, you can be a licensed therapist and not know anything about trauma. You can be a licensed therapist and not understand that trauma impacts not just your thinking mind, but your body, and physical symptoms can be caused by trauma. So if the mental health world were all, trauma trains, we'd have a lot of really wonderful, healthy people running around.
Mm-hmm. So what is a sign for people that they should deal with their trauma? In other words, are there, patterns or indicators that they should look for?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have trouble with the word trauma. It's kind of like the word narcissism. Trauma gets tossed around a lot. So trauma, to most people, they think of that's, assault, that's war, that's systemic abuse. Those are the high level things. And yes, of course, those are all traumatic things. But trauma by definition, or at least the definition I use, is anything that's less than nurturing. That's the definition that they use at the Meadows of Wickenburg, which is like the mothership for everything I talk about.
I've been there, actually.
Me too. Oh my gosh. Isn't it amazing? I love the Meadows.
It's beautiful. I wasn't a patient. I was, I was dating someone who lied about having cancer to cover up his drug addiction, and his family sent him there. And I was pregnant with his child and ended up there for a week for family week. And that actually kicked off. And I started to understand my own love addiction and codependence. And anyway, we ended up not working out. He was the second narcissist I dated. And, but that was my experience at the Meadows in Wickenburg. Yeah. It's a great place.
Oh, we need like hours, Andrea, to talk. So, yeah. So trauma is anything less than nurturing, which means it doesn't mean that everything is going to traumatize us, nor does it mean that we all experience trauma in the same degree, but it does mean that the things that we're quick to brush off, anything, a surgery, pregnancy, childbirth, all those medical things, but being abandoned, finding out your partner had an affair, betrayal trauma. There's a million types of trauma, and people who have it relatively quote unquote good, they minimize it. It's like, well, I don't really have trauma, but to answer your question all the way around full circle, if your life isn't working the way you want it to be working, and you're not thriving and happy and, full octane doing your thing, you probably have some trauma. And it doesn't have to be a forever life sentence. It's not a mental illness. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but trauma is an injury. I tell people it's like your brain gets sucker punched by life and it heals.
I love that answer. So it sounds like, we all have these traumatic things that happen to us, but we don't necessarily carry the wound with us over time. Sometimes we do.
Sometimes we do. And oh my God, if every single thing that traumatized me I carried, I would not be functional in the slightest. But you can always trace. People, right? I mean, there's just too many things, especially in a pandemic. But, what I can do with people is look at what are they experiencing? Where in their life? Is it in their sex life, their relationship life? Is it in their career? Are they under functioning? Are they over functioning? I can usually trace back the general flavor of what the trauma was by what the symptoms are.
Interesting. Can you give an example of maybe even in your own personal life of what those symptoms are that you were able to trace back?
Yeah. And I'm like you, I'm a love addict. I won't say I am a love addict. Parts of me had an extreme love addiction back in my untreated trauma days. So a lot of times I would end up in relationships with really, really toxic people because I had no sense of self. And if you trace that all back, that kind of falls under the mother wounds category. I always thought I had dad issues, and I do, but really, failure to bond adequately with mom can turn into a whole host of relationship and eating disorder kinds of things, among other things.
Yeah, I think we have the same life, Britt. Okay. So I'm making the face over here, the emoji with like the teeth showing, and it's like, ugh. That's me too. So what I heard when you said that is, to go back and trace back, the language I would use is, where do you get the most triggered in your everyday life? Is it, in your romantic relationships? Is it more, sexual things? Is it trying to have hard conversations? Is it, body stuff, parenting at work, with your male boss, with your female boss? Like that's one of the things I tell people. And also I am, and this is, and I haven't been like this the whole time. I have to, take some accountability for it. Like the whole industry of personal development and toxic positivity is rampant. And over the last handful of years, so in 2014, I went to San Antonio, Texas to get certified in Brene Brown's work in shame resilience. And that was a huge eye opener to me, more specifically in terms of negative self-talk, and I've talked about that and taught about it for so long, but I kept thinking like, why is this so pervasive with my clients? And I realized, I'm like, well, I'm putting a Band-Aid over a gaping wound, and it's really what's underneath it is shame. And so that's what opened my eyes to that. But then also as the years have gone on and looking at the personal development industry as a whole and being trauma informed, like we just aren't enough. And I'm a huge advocate for life coaches. It's unregulated. And I have my feelings about that too. And I do even if more of us were trauma informed, I think that there's a lot of, I want to be careful with my words. I think that it's an industry that can teach people unknowingly to cause harm. And that is something that we need to be more informed about.
And that's true for the mental health, the licensed mental health people too. I've seen more accurate trauma information and definitely more accurate information about narcissism from life coaches than from therapists. So I think the problems are the same in both arenas, and the capacity to do good is the same in both arenas. It's just, don't be a dick and try to find someone who's trauma informed.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's something that I have been much more cognizant about, and just to be of better service to people and their hearts and their lives. And okay, so what about, let me circle back to narcissists again. And you say that people get physically addicted to their narcissist and experience withdrawals.
Yes.
So talk to us about that.
Yes. Oh, Lord, yes. Imagine being a heroin addict and you're, injecting heroin every single day. You're going to expect at some point you're going to have to withdraw. Being the partner of a narcissist is like injecting heroin every day and not knowing and thinking that you're taking vitamin C. So, what happens in our brains when we're in these relationships is we have these reward chemicals because the narcissists aren't always awful. They alternate being wonderful and kind and empathetic and present and available with being avoidant and dismissive and detached and cruel and abusive. So when you alternate that, that's called intermittent reinforcement, fancy la-di-da psych word. But basically that's what Las Vegas thrives on. The payout, you don't know when you're going to get it. So it keeps you at the machine over and over and over again, hoping for the payout. That is a reaction that happens in your brain. And once you stop, you're going to withdraw. It's going to be like I've withdrawn off of hard drugs and I've withdrawn off of narcissists. I thought it was harder withdrawing off the narcissists physically.
Oh my gosh, my heart hurt a little bit when you explained that. So it's like that explains the breakup, get back together over and over again cycle in many relationships.
Yes. It's like quitting smoking. I'm going to quit because this is bad for me. And then what do? I mean, I was a smoker forever. You pick up because the withdrawal really, really sucks. There's a period where your brain will start to heal. And that's about 21 days from the point of no contact with a narcissist or no ingesting if it's a chemical. But it takes 21 days to get over the mountain. And that is a long 21 days to be in withdrawal.
Yeah. I have lived that.
Right. But people don't know
real.
It's a drug withdrawal. I mean, imagine a heroin addict not knowing, why am I puking? Why am I sweating? Why am I shaking? And that's what happens with partners because they don't know there's a physical addiction thing on top of all the emotional attachment stuff. So knowing that you are in physical withdrawal is the first piece in being able to even make it through those 21 days.
That's fascinating. I remember there was one point in my second abusive relationship where I don't think he had gone away to rehab yet. I think that we were in one of those cycles where it had gotten really bad and he was using again. And I was starting to get privy to everything that was actually going on and starting to understand what was really happening. And I was sitting in my car at a stoplight and I said out loud, there was nobody else in the car. And I said out loud to myself, what the fuck are you doing? And it was like a moment of clarity of like, I don't know if it was my higher self or what, just saying like, what girl, like what, this is madness. And I went back to him, but I remember like there was these points where, that must've been a time where I had spent a few days away from him and was like starting to have clarity. But I went back and it very much felt like an addiction, which is madness. And that point is complicated because when you start to realize, because when you're in denial, like when you're deep in it, there's like that a little bit of oblivion, like, it's bliss. But then when you start to get some clarity, it's like, that's a real ass kicker. In my experience, it was.
It's awful. I mean, the only thing worse than not knowing what was going on was knowing what was going on and not being able to get out.
And not being able to quit.
And it takes an average of 7 times to leave an abusive relationship. I mean, that they've done that research. And so it took me more than 7 tries as, a little slow to catch up, but there was so much that I didn't know. I mean, if I had Instagram back in the day when I was going through it, I probably would have gotten out faster, but I didn't even know what it was. I didn't even have the words to describe it until after I was already out. And then holy shit, what the hell just happened?
Well, okay. So you talk about the 21 days. So can you tell us a little bit more about how someone can begin to heal from that type of relationship?
So the physical withdrawal the first week, I tell people you're going to feel like you're dying, not metaphorically. You're going to physically feel and emotionally feel like the lights have gone out. It is going to be the darkest black hole well of shit. If you're into, I really love like sacred feminine and Greek mythology. It's like, this is your trip to the underworld. This is your dive into Hades. Remind yourself that's what's going on. You're going to have to tell yourself over and over again, this is withdrawal. I'm not crazy. Don't believe anything you think the first 7 days. And as much as you can, surround yourself with people that can remind you, don't believe anything you think for the next 7 days. Because you're breaking trauma bonds, you're breaking physiological addiction cycles. If we don't have time to get into inner children, but you're going to feel abandoned and, like you've been left out in the wild to be devoured by bears. These are all very real things that happen in those first few weeks. So, burrow in, dig in, get support. It would be like preparing to come off of any hard drug.
Oh, yeah. My armpits tingled, like just thinking about that. I think it's such a long process too. Like in my experience, it's ebbed and flowed. Like I've come lifetimes away from it, but every once in a while there's still, or if I'm doing work on something else in my life, I feel like I'll circle back to that.
Oh yeah. It's part of the story. And that's the fun thing about grief is you don't get over it. It just becomes woven into the fabric of your life story. And occasionally those threads get yanked. It's like, oh wait, oh hi, there's that thing. It's not the focal point, but it's always there.
I'm interrupting this conversation to bring you a few words about one of our sponsors. A few weeks ago, you may remember that I mentioned I was researching how to take care of my naturally and sometimes unruly wavy hair. I started following some wavy hair accounts on social media, used a few of their recommended products, but didn't get the same results they did. I needed shampoo and conditioner that was specific for my hair type and the results that I wanted. Enter Function of Beauty. It's time for you to find your go-tos that you swear by with Function of Beauty, because what works for me might be completely different for you. So here's how it works. First, you take a short quiz and tell them a little bit about your hair. Next, Function of Beauty's team determines the right blend of ingredients and bottles your custom formula. Then they deliver your personalized formula right to your door in a cute customized bottle with your favorite color and fragrance. My favorite is the pear. It smells so good. It makes me want to eat it, but I do not eat it. Don't eat it. It's not edible. It just smells that amazing. And Function of Beauty is not just the first ever custom hair care brand. It is the internet's top rated customized hair care brand with over 40,000 real 5-star reviews and counting. Go to functionofbeauty.com/kickass for 20% off and let them know you heard about it from our show. That's functionofbeauty.com/kickass. And I thank you for supporting our sponsors, which in turn supports this show. And now back to the conversation with Britt. I would love actually to kind of circle over and talk about grieving our childhoods, and more specifically, like the things that we didn't get. Because I heard you on, and I didn't get a chance to listen to the whole thing, but I heard you on another podcast where you were talking about healing from I can't remember, you said like unsympathetic mother or something like that.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, I mean, you don't have to get that specific with that, but just other parts of our lives that are a direct relation to our childhood?
Yeah. And the problem here is a lot of people had relatively, uneventful childhoods. And so having a quote, good enough mother is really, really detrimental, because most people, it feels really wrong to look at our moms as anything other than divine martyrs sent from heaven to nurture us into life. And people really struggle with shame and guilt. And the point is not to blame moms. Like, that's the biggest pushback I get is, well, you're a mom. I'm not a mom blamer. It's, most mothers have really good intentions, but intentions don't negate impact. So you may have had the most sweet, wonderful mother in the world, but let's say she was really sick the first 5 years of your life and in the hospital. It's not her fault, but you're still going to have attachment trauma. And so what we want to do is separate her intentions from what was it like for you as a daughter growing up with a human. All mothers are human. No humans are perfect. Therefore, all daughters and sons, but we're talking about, daughters here, are going to get mother wounded and have injuries. And that's okay. And it's not about blaming mom. It's about healing our wounds. And it's really important to look at it like that. Otherwise, if you are a mom, you're going to spin, oh my God, I'm screwing up my kids, or you're going to feel guilty. But every single person born of woman has a mother wound, because all mothers are human to different degrees, right? We all have it to varying degrees. And when people say, well, I had a great mom, I'm like, okay, great. How's your relationship with food? How's your relationship with sex? How's your relationship with intimacy? And we'll go from there. Yay, mom wound.
I know, because you'll eventually, kind of unravel the sweater and get there.
Right, which is really hard, but grieving childhood is necessary to become a fully functional, emotional adult. And most people don't want to do that work because, one, it requires acknowledging what was less than awesome. Two, you have to get past all the shame and the guilt. And then three is the fear of, what does that mean for me to really leave childhood behind? That means I don't ever get to expect unconditional love as an adult ever again. That's another podcast.
Yes. I know. I was just about to say, like, a lot to unpack in there as well. And I was saying this on another podcast episode. I was talking to a friend of mine and was saying that my current therapist introduced the word abandonment depression to me. I don't know. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
And she talks about, how what she sees in her patients commonly is around middle age, where we get to this place where we're admitting to the things that we didn't get, or realizing the things that we didn't get, and having to come to terms with that. And it really, again, a lot of things to unpack. One of them is that when we I have found in my experience is that when we admit and say like, here's the things that happened that we didn't get, in some ways we are letting go that things can never be different. And I think that sometimes it can be less painful to hold on, to like, maybe my parents will change now, even though they're in their, 70s or something like that. And to actually admit that like, okay, things went that way. My parents don't seem to be changing. Maybe they will, but it's not likely. And there's so much grief in that.
And there's freedom in surrendering to the futility. And this is true with narcissistic relationships and with grieving childhood. Surrendering to the futility that this will ever be something different actually has freedom. That's a really unpleasant path to walk, but that path does eventually end and you get to walk back out into the sun. The other one of maybe it'll be different, that is a circular path that goes nowhere. And so, like you said, starting with admitting this is what this is never going to be any different, frees you up to do grief work, because you can't grieve until you know that a loss has occurred. And if you're hanging on to that, maybe this time, you haven't gotten to grief yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As a mom myself, my kids are, my son just turned 13 and my daughter's about to be 11 next week. And I've gone down that path of like, oh my God, I'm going to screw them up, and like trying to kind of do this like dog and pony show. And speaking of surrender, I finally just surrendered, as I sort of walked into my own, family of origin therapy. I'm like, they're going to end up in therapy talking about me. They are. And all I can do is my best. And also I started asking them like, how can I show up better for you? Like, I'm not like, P.S. I'm not saying I'm going to do it. Like, whatever they say, like, buy me all the clothes I want. That's what my daughter would say. But just, I want to have an open conversation for them to be able to say like, I don't like it when you use that tone with me, or because I'm not perfect. And sometimes I royally fuck up and do things that my own mother did to me that hurt me, and relive these patterns. And they're going to end up in therapy talking about me. Like,
which
I just
is
hope that
fine.
they feel good going. Mm-hmm.
I have an Instagram post actually for this week where it's not messing up your kids that messes up the kids. It's failure to acknowledge that you're messing up your kids that messes up your kids. So all parents are going to screw up the kids because we're all human, right? But that's not what actually,
by humans. Yeah.
Right. But that's not what causes damage. What causes damage are parents who refuse to acknowledge their own humanness. That's where the kids end up with all kinds of, carried trauma and carried shame and all of that. But if you're just doing normal humaning and you bang up against stuff, hey, I did that imperfectly, or saying, God forbid, I'm sorry to a kid, those things are easy to repair.
Yeah. God, I found that to be complicated. I've had clients who shared with me, over the last decade or so, that they got up the courage to write their parent a letter and say like, this was my experience. And then it's met with, and we work on that. Like, you can only have control of how you show up, and wouldn't it be great if they show, if they responded this way, but we don't know. But, when the parent gets defensive and says like, that's not how I remember it, and just dismissing their experience, like that can be incredibly heartbreaking and re-traumatizing old wounds. And I get why people would avoid that conversation.
I mean, it's painful. It's so painful. I remember, and I'll say this here, telling my mother, hey, I think I experienced sexual abuse as a kid. And the first response I got was, that's impossible. I was a good mom. That didn't happen.
Oh my. Mm-hmm.
So acknowledgement and validation is medicine for any type of wounding that as a parent you're inflicting on your kids. I mean, it's magic what validation can do.
And listening. And taking responsibility. I think it's just, parenting has been one of the things for me that has been my biggest teacher. Turn the mirror on me in so many ways. Oh my gosh. Okay. I want to ask about 2020 and
that got heavy.
COVID and the civil unrest that we're experiencing. And how has COVID affected your work? I mean, beyond not being able to see clients in person.
So this one is also heavy, but a different heavy. So I had COVID. So I got to have 5 weeks of, oh, that's what this is. So we are in the middle of this incredibly traumatizing circumstance, but you don't actually have the symptoms of trauma until the thing is over. So right now, everyone's in survival mode, and we have yet to even see what does post-COVID trauma look and feel like. I know for me, like you said earlier, being forced to be at home all the time has brought up everyone's shit. So I don't think I've ever been this busy in my career, because all of a sudden we have time to think. And when you have time and space to think, all the unhealed content comes up. And something like COVID is going to trigger all of those parenting wounds, right? Because we don't know when the end is coming. We don't know if we're going to be getting sick or how we're going to stay safe.
Trying to keep our children safe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be traumatic in and of itself, but you throw on some, undealt with early childhood wounding, and everything is going to get triggered. Everything is going to get triggered. And that's really what we're seeing now, is trauma on top of trauma. COVID trauma on top of early childhood unaddressed trauma. Yay.
Oh my gosh. What I'm curious, and I don't know how much you can share, like, have you seen a pattern, if anything, with the people that are coming to you now as opposed to even last year?
So I think, and I can say that generically as a composite, everyone has their own issues, but by and large, if I was going to sum up kind of what is the heart cry of this year, is I want my mom, is the heart cry. Not literally, but that's the vibe. That's the feeling in the air, is where's my mom? Things are scary. I don't care how old they are. I have clients, I've seen clients as young as 2 and as old as 80. And I want my mom is the prevailing thing. Now, if you don't have any parental woundings, you can cope with that, but that's what's happening. And there's a lot of parent wounding stuff that is surprising the hell out of people who think they're coming in because they're stressed out about homeschooling, or they think I'm stressed out because my partner is here in my face all the time. But, when things are scary, kids want their mom.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I don't know how related this is, but it just popped into my mind. I was listening to NPR last night, and they were talking about, they were interviewing a bunch of Gen Z young adults and young Americans, I should say. And it's their first election that they're going to be able to vote. And they were talking, to all different people and different beliefs and things like that. But this one young woman said, what was interesting to me, and I had never truly thought about that. And she said, we're the first generation to be voting now who has never known a life before 9/11. And, we were born, and then, for a lot of them, it was a pretty bad recession. And then, and I'm like, wow, like I guess I never really thought of, I was born 1975, where we had a long run of just like patriotism, yay. And then, I was in my 20s when 9/11 happened. And so it was fascinating to me how that part, and then also, and I'm curious on about your take on this. And what I see is, baby boomers, and I'm making a sweeping generalization here. They grew up where it was, and my parents actually were even the generation before them, which was nicknamed the silent generation, where you didn't talk about your problems, like fuck your feelings, like that whole thing. And I feel like the pendulum has swung like way the other way, and where Gen Z, they're very in touch with their feelings. And also, like, I see a little bit of over-identification at times where what is your take on that?
Oh boy. Okay. So I'm with you that there's a degree to which focusing on our stuff can be detrimental. So over-identify, and people get a lot, I get a lot of pushback when I talk about diagnoses, and a lot of them are incorrect. A lot of times we identify with our quote unquote disorders as a way of bypassing the pain that caused them. I'm going to say that again because it's important and it's a mouthful. So I would have been diagnosed with what they would have called borderline personality disorder back in the day when I was in my 20s. And I since learned it's complex trauma and da-da-da-da-da. But for a long time, I held on to, this is my diagnosis. This is just who I am. This is my disease. Therefore, I don't have to look at all the pain and all the awfulness that created the disorder in the first place. So not for everyone and not every time. I'm going to have DMs filled with it. But we can over-identify with our disorders as a way of bypassing pain. which is absolutely something that happens. I have college kids and teenagers who'll be like, and I have this and this and this, and I have panic disorder and agoraphobia and, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, how about let's talk about that thing that happened? Nope. This is my disorder. And they come in with their notepad and their little mini DSM guides. And we absolutely use over-identification as another coping skill, another bypassing avenue, which is really ironic that we use our very own diagnoses to avoid the things that created them.
Mm-hmm. And probably in some ways to avoid having, taking responsibility or taking any kind of accountability for behaviors.
That I did that. I was like, nope, I'm a victim and I don't have to deal with my shit because poor me. And then
I did too. Like seeking sympathy 100%. Who's on my team? Line up.
Right. Look how sick I am. I'm the best worst. I'm so jacked up.
I'm the best worst.
Love me.
Oh my God. Can we have t-shirts that say that? I'm the best worst. I love that. I appreciate you saying that because as someone who grew up a little bit with, the mentality of, suck it up, buttercup, just keep on keeping on. I worry sometimes that I'm like, am I just not being compassionate enough? But I can see both sides.
Absolutely. And it's like you said, it's levels. You always want to validate pain. I don't always validate when people want to stick to the terminology or the diagnosis, but it's like, okay, forget the words and the diagnoses. You seem like you're in a lot of pain. Let's start there. That's always a good place to start.
Yeah. I think too, when, personally, I have been emotionally manipulated by someone else. And so I tend to not trust people's emotions sometimes. And I'm like, is there an ulterior motive here? Are you trying to manipulate me? And so I have to be careful of that too. So that's a whole nother conversation for another time.
Yay, boundaries. Well, I mean, a person with healthy boundaries and all their attachment stuff dealt with can be in the presence of someone having huge feelings and not absorb it. So even if they're trying to manipulate you, if you've got your attachment shields up, it won't matter. You're unfuckwittable.
I had to learn to get to that place, especially in the second relationship that I was in. And it's possible to heal and to move on and to get that clarity. And I am so glad that I had you on. This went by so fast.
Oh my gosh.
We covered so many things. And I don't want to let you go before I just give you the opportunity. Was there something kind of on the tip of your tongue or in the back of your mind that you wanted to say that we might have skipped?
Yeah, because we did all you have trauma, you have mommy issues, it's COVID. I really want to say that healing with access to resources, the willingness to commit to the change process, healing is absolutely possible. And if one of those things isn't possible, there are levels of healing that are available. Our brains are absolute magnificent things. They are designed to heal. They are wired to heal. Healing is possible. Had to say that.
100%. All right. So people can find out more about you at thegreenhousekc.com. We'll put those links in the show notes. I know you said that you're active on Instagram. Is that where you want people to go to find you?
That's the best place. I'm at Britt Frank, and Britt has 2 T's.
Britt Frank on Instagram, everybody. And again, all the important links are in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here. This has been so interesting. And I took some notes over here and wrote some things down that I'm going to Google and over-identify my heart out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for being here. I am so grateful for your time. I know how valuable it is and am just honored that you choose to spend it here with me and my guests. So until next time, everyone, I will see you all out in cyberspace. Bye-bye.